December 7, 1944, Philippine Sea. Commander Takeshi Yamamoto pressed his eye against the rangefinder aboard the mighty battleship Yamato, scanning the horizon for American ships. His crew stood ready at their 18.1-inch guns, the largest naval weapons ever built. After 3 years of war, Yamamoto still believed in Japanese superiority. Their guns could sink any American ship, if they could just get close enough. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Massive geysers of water suddenly erupted around the Japanese fleet. Shell splashes taller than buildings. Yamamoto's blood ran cold as he calculated the size. These weren't the 14-inch shells he expected from American cruisers. These were 16-inch battleship rounds. "Impossible," he whispered. His lookouts reported empty ocean in every direction. Then came the second salvo and the third. Each one walked closer to his ship with mechanical precision. Yamamoto frantically swept his rangefinder across the horizon. Nothing. No muzzle flashes, no smoke, no ships. "Sir," his spotter shouted, "range to the enemy fleet 38,000 meters." Yamamoto's hands trembled. 38,000 meters! That was over 23 miles. His own mighty guns could barely reach 26 miles, and certainly not with any accuracy. Yet somehow the Americans were landing shells all around them from a distance that should have been impossible. What Yamamoto didn't know was that he was facing the USS Iowa, a ship that would shatter everything the Japanese Navy believed about naval warfare. This wasn't just about bigger guns or better armor. This was about a technological revolution that had been happening in American shipyards while Japan was still fighting the last war. The Iowa wasn't just a battleship, it was a floating computer. While Japanese gunners were still using manual calculations and visual range-finding, the Americans had developed radar-controlled fire direction systems that could track targets beyond the horizon and calculate firing solutions with mechanical precision. Their shells weren't just flying farther, they were flying smarter. But here's what's truly shocking. The technological gap was just the beginning. What the Japanese Navy was really up against wasn't just superior engineering. It was an industrial machine that could build these technological marvels faster than Japan could even comprehend. While Japan struggled to complete a single battleship, American shipyards were mass-producing Iowa-class battleships like automobiles. Each one contained more steel than Japan's entire monthly production. Each one carried enough ammunition to supply a Japanese battleship for months. And each one was manned by crews who had trained on simulators and mechanical computers that most Japanese officers had never even imagined. Commander Yamamoto was witnessing the moment when 20th century industrial warfare met 19th century military thinking. His mighty Yamato, with its massive guns and thick armor, had been designed to fight the previous war. But the Americans had already moved on to the next one. As those 16-inch shells continued to fall around his ship with terrifying accuracy, Yamamoto began to realize something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Japan hadn't just underestimated American resolve or fighting spirit. They had fundamentally misunderstood what kind of enemy they were fighting. This wasn't a nation of soft civilians playing at war. This was an industrial empire that had turned warfare into a science and battleship construction into mass production. While Japanese shipwrights were still handcrafting vessels like ancient samurai swords, Americans were stamping out warships on assembly lines with the same efficiency they used to build automobiles. But the most terrifying realization was yet to come.
Because what happened next would prove that the technological gap was only part of a much larger story, one that would reshape Yamamoto's entire understanding of power, progress, and what it really meant to fight a modern war. The question that would torment him and that still haunts military historians today was this: how could an entire nation's military leadership so completely misjudge not just their enemy's capabilities, but the very nature of the war they were fighting? December 7th, 1944. The Pacific Ocean stretched out like a blue mirror under the morning sun. Commander Takeshi Yamamoto stood on the bridge of the mighty battleship Yamato, watching his men prepare for another day of war. The ship was huge, longer than 3 football fields put together. Its guns were the biggest in the world, each one able to shoot shells as heavy as cars over 26 miles away. Yamamoto had been fighting this war for 3 years now. He remembered the early days when Japanese ships ruled the seas. Back then, every battle ended with American ships running away or sinking to the bottom. Those were good times, times when every Japanese sailor believed they were the best in the world. The emperor had told them they were fighting for honor, for Japan, for their families back home. The newspapers said American sailors were weak and lazy. They said American ships were built too fast and fell apart in real fights. Yamamoto believed these things because everyone believed them. Why would their leaders lie? On this December morning, the ocean felt different. Yamamoto could not say why, but something seemed wrong. The water was too quiet, too still. His lookouts had seen American planes the day before, flying high overhead like metal birds. But no ships, no enemy fleet, just empty blue water as far as anyone could see. The Yamato carried over 2,500 men. Each one had trained for years to fight on this ship. They knew every bolt, every pipe, every gun. The main guns were so big that when they fired, the whole ship shook like an earthquake. These guns could punch through 3 feet of steel armor. No American ship could stand against them in a fair fight. But wars were not always fair.
Yamamoto lifted his looking glass to scan the horizon. The morning sun made everything bright and hard to see. His eyes searched for smoke, for masts, for anything that looked like enemy ships. He saw nothing but endless water and scattered clouds. Behind him, his gun crews went through their morning drills. They moved like dancers, each man knowing exactly what to do. Load the shell, ram it home, set the powder charge, wait for orders. These men could fire 3 shells every 2 minutes when they needed to, fast enough to sink any ship that came too close. The radio man called out ranges and bearings from other Japanese ships. 6 battleships sailed together today, along with dozens of smaller ships. It was a powerful fleet, maybe the most powerful fleet Japan had ever put to sea. Yamamoto felt proud to be part of it. At exactly 9:15 in the morning, everything changed. The first shell hit the water half a mile away. It made a splash as tall as a building. Water crushed down on nearby ships like a waterfall. The sound was like thunder, but louder, much louder. Yamamoto had heard thousands of shells hit the water before. This one was different, bigger, heavier. His men looked around with worried faces. Where had that come from? The lookouts shouted reports from every direction. No enemy ships in sight, no muzzle flashes, no smoke clouds, nothing. Then came the second shell. This one landed closer, maybe 300 yards away. The splash was even bigger. Water flew higher than their main mast. The ship rocked from the wave it made. Yamamoto grabbed the rail to keep from falling. His heart started beating fast.
These were not small shells from destroyers or cruisers. These were big shells, battleship shells, maybe even bigger than their own. But how could that be? Where were they coming from? "Range to enemy fleet," Yamamoto shouted to his rangefinder operator. The young sailor pressed his eye to the machine and turned the dials. He looked again, turned more dials. His face went pale. "Sir, I show no enemy ships within 30,000 meters." 30,000 meters? That was about 18 miles. Japanese guns could shoot farther than that, but not much farther, and certainly not with good aim. You had to see your target to hit it. Everyone knew that. The third shell landed even closer. This time, Yamamoto could see the size of the splash clearly. His blood turned cold. That splash was huge, bigger than anything their own guns made, which meant the shell was bigger too, much bigger. "Sound general quarters," he ordered. "All guns, prepare for surface action." Alarms rang throughout the ship. Men ran to their battle stations. Gun turrets swung around, searching for targets. But there was nothing to shoot at, just empty ocean and the memory of those enormous splashes. The fourth shell missed their ship by less than 100 yards. Yamamoto felt the shockwave in his chest. Pieces of hot metal flew through the air. One piece clanged against the bridge windows. If that shell had hit the ship, it would have gone through their armor like paper through a wall. "Sir," the rangefinder operator called out, his voice shaking, "I have contacts on the horizon, bearing 270, range 38,000 meters. Yamamoto felt dizzy. 38,000 meters. That was over 23 miles. No gun in the world could shoot that far and hit anything. It was impossible. The shells would fall short or fly wild. Physics would not allow it. But the shells kept coming. Each one landed closer to the Japanese ships. Each splash is bigger than the last. And with each shell, Yamamoto's world began to crack apart like thin ice. He had spent his whole life believing certain things. Japanese guns were the biggest. Japanese ships were the strongest. Japanese sailors were the bravest. American ships were weak and poorly made. American sailors were cowards who would run from a real fight. But these shells were not coming from weak ships with cowardly crews. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. "Signal all ships," Yamamoto ordered. "Form battle line. Prepare to advance on enemy fleet." If they could get closer, their guns would have a chance. Japanese gunners were trained for close combat, face-to-face battles where skill and courage mattered more than fancy equipment. They just had to survive long enough to get within range. But as more shells fell around the fleet, each one landing with scientific precision, Yamamoto began to understand that this would not be like any battle he had fought before. The Americans were not just shooting at them from impossible distances. They were hitting them from impossible distances. The ocean around the Japanese fleet turned white with shell splashes. Waterspouts rose like towers, then crashed down with the sound of breaking mountains. And through it all, the enemy ships remained invisible, hidden beyond the curve of the earth itself. For the first time in 3 years of war, Commander Takeshi Yamamoto felt afraid. Not afraid of dying, which was always possible in battle. Afraid of something much worse. Afraid that everything he believed about this war, about his navy, about his country's chances of winning, might be completely wrong. The shells kept falling, and with each one, the foundation of his faith began to crumble like sand.
The shells kept coming for 2 hours, each one bigger than the last, each one more accurate. Commander Yamamoto watched his beautiful fleet scatter like leaves in a storm. 3 destroyers were already sinking. The battleship Musashi had a hole in her side big enough to drive a truck through. And still, the American ships remained invisible beyond the horizon. When the shooting finally stopped, Yamamoto's hands were shaking, not from fear, but from something worse: confusion. His whole life, he had been taught that Japanese ships were the best in the world. Their guns shot the farthest. Their armor was the thickest. Their sailors fought the hardest. But today, none of that seemed to matter. Back at port 3 days later, Yamamoto sat in a small room reading reports that made his stomach feel sick. Intelligence officers had captured documents from a downed American plane. The papers told a story that seemed impossible. The ship that had attacked them was called USS Iowa. It was not even the biggest battleship in the American fleet. There were 3 more just like it, with plans to build even more. Each one weighed 68,000 tons when fully loaded. That was bigger than Yamato, which everyone said was the largest warship ever built. But the size was not the worst part. The worst part was how fast the Americans built them. The Iowa took less than 3 years from start to finish. 3 years to build a ship bigger than anything Japan had ever made. Meanwhile, Japan's newest battleship had taken over 6 years to complete, and they could only build one at a time. Yamamoto read the numbers again and again, hoping he had made a mistake. But the math was clear. American shipyards were building big warships faster than Japan could build small ones. How was that possible? He kept reading. The documents talked about something called radar fire control. Yamamoto had heard of radar before, but only as a way to spot enemy planes. The Americans had somehow put radar on their big guns. This let them shoot at targets they couldn't even see, targets beyond the horizon, targets 25 miles away or more. While Japanese gunners still used their eyes and simple math to aim their shots, American gunners had machines that did the math for them, machines that never get tired, machines that never made mistakes, machines that could track moving targets and predict exactly where they would be when the shells arrived. The numbers made Yamamoto's head hurt. Each Iowa carried over 1,200 shells for its main guns. 1,200 shells that could each punch through 2 feet of steel armor. Japan's entire monthly shell production was less than what one American ship carried into battle. But there was more, much more. The reports described American factories that worked day and night, factories bigger than entire Japanese cities. One factory alone made more steel in a month than all of Japan made in 3 months. Another factory built engines so fast they had to store them in fields because they ran out of warehouse space. Yamamoto tried to imagine factories that big. He couldn't. The biggest factory in Japan employed maybe 2,000 workers. American factories employed 50,000 workers or more. Some worked day shifts, some worked night shifts. The machines never stopped running. Every day, American shipyards launched new ships, not just battleships, but destroyers, cruisers, aircraft carriers, transport ships, landing craft. Hundreds of new ships every month. While Japan struggled to replace the ships they had lost, America was building entire new fleets. The reports showed pictures of American shipyards taken by spy planes. Yamamoto stared at them in silence. Rows and rows of ships under construction, cranes as tall as mountains, workers swarming over metal like ants. It looked like something from a dream or a nightmare. One picture showed an American aircraft carrier that had been completed in just 11 months. 11 months from first steel cut to final sea trials. Japan's newest carrier had taken 4 years to build and was still not finished. How could any country work so fast?
The answer was in the next set of papers. While Japanese workers still cut and shape steel by hand, American factories used machines to do most of the work. Machines that cut steel perfectly every time. Machines that welded joints stronger than human hands could make. Machines that painted, wired, and installed equipment without getting tired. Every day, American shipyards launched new ships, not just battleships, but destroyers, cruisers, aircraft carriers, transport ships, landing craft. Hundreds of new ships every month. While Japan struggled to replace the ships they had lost, America was building entire new fleets. The reports showed pictures of American shipyards taken by spy planes. Yamamoto stared at them in silence. Rows and rows of ships under construction, cranes as tall as mountains, workers swarming over metal like ants. It looked like something from a dream or a nightmare. One picture showed an American aircraft carrier that had been completed in just 11 months. 11 months from first steel cut to final sea trials. Japan's newest carrier had taken 4 years to build and was still not finished. How could any country work so fast? The answer was in the next set of papers. While Japanese workers still cut and shape steel by hand, American factories used machines to do most of the work. Machines that cut steel perfectly every time. Machines that welded joints stronger than human hands could make. Machines that painted, wired, and installed equipment without getting tired.
Americans had turned shipbuilding into something like making cars. Standard parts that fit together the same way every time. Assembly lines where each worker did one job perfectly instead of trying to do everything. Quality control that caught mistakes before they became problems. Yamamoto found a chart that compared shell production. Japan made about 500 large shells per month. America made over 20,000 per month. 20,000! That was enough to supply the entire Japanese Navy for 3 years, and the Americans made that many every 30 days. The radio room brought more bad news every hour. American submarines were sinking Japanese supply ships faster than Japan could build new ones. American bombers were hitting Japanese factories and ports almost every night. American carriers were attacking Japanese bases with hundreds of planes at once. But the numbers that scared Yamamoto the most were about oil. Japan had started this war with enough oil for maybe 2 years of fighting. Now, 3 years later, they were almost out. Ships sat in port because there was no fuel. Planes could not fly training missions because there was no gasoline. Factories ran at half speed because there was no diesel for the machines. America produced more oil in 1 week than Japan used in 6 months. American ships never worried about fuel. American planes flew training missions every day. American factories ran full speed around the clock because they had all the energy they needed. The intelligence reports included something even more shocking. Captured American sailors talked about ice cream ships. Special ships that did nothing but make ice cream for other ships in the fleet. Ice cream ships. While Japanese sailors got 1 small bowl of rice per day and were grateful for it, American sailors complained if their ice cream was not cold enough. There were stories about American supply ships that carried nothing but Coca-Cola. Thousands of bottles of Coca-Cola delivered fresh to ships in the middle of the ocean. Other supply ships brought steaks, fresh bread, real butter, and vegetables. American sailors ate better in the middle of a war than most Japanese civilians ate during peacetime. Yamamoto thought about his own men. They had not seen fresh meat in months. Their daily rice ration got smaller every week. Many were getting sick from poor food and no vitamins. Meanwhile, American sailors were complaining about having to eat the same flavor of ice cream 2 days in a row. The contrast was too big to understand. 2 countries fighting the same war but living in completely different worlds.
One world where ships were hand-built treasures that took years to complete and could not be replaced when lost. Another world where ships rolled off assembly lines like newspapers from a printing press. One world where every bullet was precious and every drop of fuel was saved and measured. Another world where supply ships brought ice cream and soda pop to the front lines just to keep the sailors happy. As Yamamoto read report after report, a terrible thought began to form in his mind. Maybe this war was not about who fought harder or who wanted to win more. Maybe it was about who could build more ships, make more shells, and feed more sailors. Maybe courage and honor and fighting spirit didn't matter if the other side had 10 times more of everything. For 3 years, he had believed that Japanese spirit could overcome American machines. Now he was starting to wonder if American machines were too many and too good for any spirit to overcome. The question that kept him awake at night was simple and terrifying. If America could build ships this fast, make shells this quickly, and feed their sailors this well while fighting a war on the other side of the world, what would happen when they turned all that power toward finishing this fight? 2 weeks later, Commander Yamamoto stood on the bridge of the Yamato again. This time, he could see the American ships with his own eyes. 4 gray shapes on the horizon, moving in a perfect line. The USS Iowa and her sister ships. They looked small from 20 miles away, but Yamamoto knew better now. He knew what those distant shapes could do. The morning was clear and calm, perfect weather for a sea battle. If this had been 1942, Yamamoto would have felt excited, eager to prove Japanese fighting spirit against American steel. But now, in early 1945, he felt only a cold weight in his stomach. His gun crews were ready. The massive turrets turned slowly, tracking the enemy ships. Each gun was loaded with armor-piercing shells that weighed as much as small cars. The rangefinder operators called out distances and bearings. Everything looked normal. Everything felt wrong. At exactly 10:30 in the morning, the American ships opened fire. Yamamoto watched through his binoculars as tiny flashes appeared on the distant hulls. 4 ships firing together, 16 shells racing through the air at 3 times the speed of sound. He started counting. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. At 45 seconds, the first shells arrived. They fell around the Japanese fleet like rain from an angry sky. Each explosion sent up a tower of white water higher than a 10-story building. The sound was not just noise, it was pressure that hit his body like a giant fist. His teeth rattled, his bones shook. But what scared him most was how close they were. First salvo, and already the shells were landing within 200 yards of his ship. After 45 seconds of flight over 23 miles of ocean, the American gunners had put their shots almost exactly where they wanted them. Yamamoto gave the order to return fire. The Yamamoto's main guns roared like angry gods. Flames shot out longer than football fields. The ship heeled over from the force. Every man on deck was knocked to his knees. It was the most powerful sound on Earth. The Japanese shells flew toward the American fleet. Yamamoto watched through his glass, waiting to see the splashes, waiting to see if Japanese steel could reach American ships. He waited 48 seconds. Then he saw them, tiny white puffs on the horizon. Their shells had fallen short by almost 2 miles. 2 miles short of a target they could barely see, while American shells were landing close enough to count the rivets on his ship's hull.
The second American salvo came 55 seconds after the first. This time, 3 shells landed within 100 yards. Pieces of hot metal screamed through the air. One chunk punched through the bridge window, missing Yamamoto's head by inches. Another piece tore through the radar antenna above them. They fired again and again. Each time, their shells fell a little closer to the American ships, but never close enough. Meanwhile, the American shells kept getting closer and closer to them. It was like watching a chess game where one player could see the whole board and the other player was blindfolded. At 11:15, disaster struck. The third American salvo included 8 shells instead of the usual 16. Half the enemy guns had changed targets. Yamamoto watched in horror as 4 massive explosions erupted around the battleship Nagato. The first shell missed. The second shell hit the water 10 feet from her bow. The third shell hit her directly. The explosion was unlike anything Yamamoto had ever seen. A ball of orange fire taller than the ship itself. Smoke and steam and pieces of metal flying in every direction. When the smoke cleared, the Nagato's front turret was gone, just gone. 60 men had been inside that turret. Now there was only twisted metal and a hole big enough to park a train inside. The fourth shell hit 30 seconds later. This one struck near the engine room. The Nagato slowed, then stopped, then began to list to one side. Water poured into her hull through the massive hole. In less than 5 minutes, one of Japan's proudest battleships was dying. Yamamoto felt something break inside his chest. Not his ribs or his heart. Something deeper. Something that had held his world together for 47 years of life. He had believed that Japanese ships were stronger. Japanese guns were bigger. Japanese sailors were braver. He had believed that fighting spirit and love of country could overcome any enemy. He had believed that the emperor's blessing made them invincible. But the Nagato was sinking. Her brave crew was drowning. Their fighting spirit meant nothing to the American shells that had torn her apart from 23 miles away. While he watched his sister ship die, another realization hit him like a physical blow. The Americans were not just better at building ships and making shells. They were better at using them. Their gunners could hit targets that Japanese gunners could not even see clearly. Their machines could calculate solutions that Japanese minds could not work out fast enough. This was not about having newer equipment or more supplies. This was about understanding war in a completely different way. The Americans had turned naval combat into a science. They measured everything. They calculated everything. They left nothing to chance or courage or fighting spirit. Japanese naval tactics were based on honor and tradition. Get close to the enemy, fight with skill and bravery, win through superior will and determination. These ideas had worked for 1,000 years of Japanese warfare. But American naval tactics were based on mathematics and engineering. Stay far from the enemy. Use machines to aim your guns. Win through superior technology and industrial power. It was a new kind of warfare that made the old kind look like children playing with sticks. Yamamoto pulled out his small diary and wrote with shaking hands. Today I learned that courage cannot defeat radar. Today I learned that honor cannot stop a shell fired by a machine that never gets tired, never gets scared, never makes mistakes. He paused and looked up at the American ships, still firing their perfectly aimed salvos from their impossible distance. Then he wrote more. We were taught that Americans were soft, that they loved comfort more than victory, that they would quit when the fighting got hard. But their machines speak of precision we cannot match. Their abundance speaks of power we never understood. The Nagato was almost gone now. Her bow pointed toward the sky like a prayer. Her stern was already underwater. A few tiny figures jumped from her deck into the cold Pacific. Maybe 50 men out of 1,500 would be rescued. Another American salvo whistled overhead. This one targeted the Yamato directly.
16 shells, each weighing over 2,000 pounds, screaming down from the sky like falling stars. They hit the water in a perfect pattern around the ship. If any one of them had been 50 yards closer, Yamamoto would have joined his friends on the Nagato at the bottom of the sea. As water from the shell splashes crashed down on his bridge, washing away 3 years of certainty and pride, Yamamoto understood what this war was really about. It was not about which country had braver soldiers or stronger ships or better fighting spirit. It was about which country could turn war into a factory assembly line. Which country could mass-produce victory the same way they mass-produced everything else. Japan had been fighting World War II with World War I ideas. Close combat, personal skill, individual heroism. Meanwhile, America had moved on to something new. Remote combat, machine precision, industrial power. It was a new kind of warfare that made the old kind look like children playing with sticks. Yamamoto pulled out his small diary and wrote with shaking hands. Today I learned that courage cannot defeat radar. Today I learned that honor cannot stop a shell fired by a machine that never gets tired, never gets scared, never makes mistakes. He paused and looked up at the American ships, still firing their perfectly aimed salvos from their impossible distance. Then he wrote more. We were taught that Americans were soft, that they loved comfort more than victory, that they would quit when the fighting got hard. But their machines speak of precision we cannot match. Their abundance speaks of power we never understood. The Nagato was almost gone now. Her bow pointed toward the sky like a prayer. Her stern was already underwater. A few tiny figures jumped from her deck into the cold Pacific. Maybe 50 men out of 1,500 would be rescued. Another American salvo whistled overhead. This one targeted the Yamato directly. 16 shells, each weighing over 2,000 pounds, screaming down from the sky like falling stars. They hit the water in a perfect pattern around the ship. If any one of them had been 50 yards closer, Yamamoto would have joined his friends on the Nagato at the bottom of the sea. As water from the shell splashes crashed down on his bridge, washing away 3 years of certainty and pride, Yamamoto understood what this war was really about. It was not about which country had braver soldiers or stronger ships or better fighting spirit. It was about which country could turn war into a factory assembly line. Which country could mass-produce victory the same way they mass-produced everything else. Japan had been fighting World War II with World War I ideas. Close combat, personal skill, individual heroism. Meanwhile, America had moved on to something new. Remote combat, machine precision, industrial power. He wrote one final line in his diary as the American shells continued to fall around his dying fleet. We have been fighting with swords against machine guns, believing our spirit made us equal. Today I learned that spirit without science is just another way to lose. The battle lasted 6 more hours. When it was over, 3 Japanese battleships were sunk and 2 more were badly damaged. The American ships sailed away without a single serious hit. They had fought the entire battle from beyond the range where Japanese guns could hurt them. That night, as rescue ships pulled survivors from the oil-covered water, Yamamoto finally accepted what he had been trying not to believe for months. Japan had already lost this war. Maybe they had lost it on the day it started, when they chose to fight an industrial empire with feudal ideas about honor and courage. The real question now was not whether they would lose, but how much of Japan would be left when the losing was finally over. September 15, 1946. The train wheezed to a stop at Yokohama Station with a sound like an old man dying. Commander Takeshi Yamamoto stepped onto the platform, carrying everything he owned in a small cloth bag. After 18 months in an American prison camp, he was finally coming home to Japan. But the Japan he saw was not the Japan he had left. The station was half destroyed. Bomb craters filled with dirty water dotted the ground like giant footprints.
Children with hollow eyes and dirty faces watched him pass. They looked older than children should look. Hunger had aged them before their time. Some held out thin hands, begging for food he did not have. Others just stared with the blank look of people who had seen too much death. His own house was still standing, but barely. The roof had holes that let in rain and snow. The windows were covered with paper instead of glass. His wife Keiko met him at the door, and for a moment he did not recognize her. She had lost so much weight that her clothes hung on her like curtains. Her hair was grey now, though she was only 38 years old. Their reunion was quiet. Too much had happened for loud celebrations. Too much had been lost for easy joy. They held each other in the ruined doorway while ash from distant fires fell like snow around them. That night, sitting by a small fire made from pieces of broken furniture, Yamamoto told his wife about the American prison camp. But he did not tell her about the battles or the ships or the men who had died. Instead, he told her about the things that had surprised him most. The American guards had given the Japanese prisoners 3 meals every day. Not rice and thin soup, but real food. Meat, bread, vegetables, milk. More food than most Japanese civilians had seen since the war started. When prisoners got sick, American doctors treated them the same way they treated American patients. When winter came, the Americans gave them warm coats and blankets. Yamamoto had expected cruelty. He had been taught that Americans were savages who would torture their prisoners and leave them to die. Instead, he found efficiency and organization that made even caring for enemies look like a science. The prison camp had a library with books about engineering, mathematics, and industrial production. Yamamoto spent months reading these books, trying to understand how America had built so much so quickly. The answers were in those pages, written in simple language that any high school student could follow. American success was not magic, it was method. While Japan had tried to build everything by hand using ancient techniques, America had invented machines that could do the work of hundreds of men. While Japan had kept industrial secrets locked away in the minds of master craftsmen, America had written everything down in books that anyone could read and learn from. The Americans had turned manufacturing into something like cooking from a recipe. Exact measurements, precise timing, standard ingredients that work the same way every time. Any factory in America could make the same part using the same methods and get the same results. This let them build ships faster, make engines stronger, and produce ammunition cheaper than anyone had thought possible. But the most important thing Yamamoto had learned was not about machines or methods. It was about thinking. American engineers were taught to question everything, test everything, measure everything. If something did not work, they changed it. If something could be improved, they improved it. They never assumed that old ways were the best ways just because they were old. Japanese engineers, including Yamamoto himself, had been taught to respect tradition and follow the wisdom of their elders. If the old masters had built ships a certain way, then that was the right way. If ancient techniques had worked for hundreds of years, then they would keep working forever.
This thinking had made Japan strong in the past, but it had made them weak in a war against people who were always looking for better ways to do everything. Keiko listened to these stories without saying much. When he finished talking, she was quiet for a long time. Finally, she asked the question that had been haunting both of them. What happens to us now? What happens to Japan? Yamamoto looked out through their paper-covered window at the ruins of Yokohama. In the distance, he could see American ships in the harbor. Not warships this time, but cargo ships bringing food and medicine and supplies to help rebuild what the war had destroyed. The same country that had crushed Japan with industrial might was now helping Japan survive with industrial generosity. "We learn," he said quietly. "We learn everything they can teach us about building things the right way, about organizing work the smart way, about using science instead of tradition to solve problems." Over the following months, Yamamoto found work as a translator for American reconstruction teams. His job was to help Japanese workers understand American building methods and safety procedures. Every day, he saw the difference between old ways and new ways of getting things done. Japanese work crews still did everything by hand, the way their grandfathers had taught them. They cut wood with hand saws, carried materials on their backs, and used only simple tools that had been made the same way for centuries. The work was hard and slow, but it was the work they knew how to do. American work crews used power tools that could cut through steel like butter. They had machines that could lift loads heavier than 20 men could carry. They had equipment that could dig foundations, pour concrete, and raise walls in days instead of weeks. Most importantly, they had systems that let many people work on the same project without getting in each other's way. Yamamoto watched and learned and wrote everything down in notebooks that he filled page after page. He was not the only one. All over Japan, people were watching the Americans work and asking themselves why they had never thought of these methods before. The answer was always the same. Because they had been taught that the old ways were the only ways. Because they had believed that tradition was more important than results. Because they had confused being proud of the past with being prepared for the future. In 1947, Yamamoto's first son was born. As he held the tiny boy in his arms, he made a promise that he whispered so quietly even Keiko could not hear. This child would grow up learning American methods along with Japanese values. This child would understand that respecting your ancestors did not mean copying everything they did. This child would know the difference between honoring the past and being trapped by it. He named the boy Hiroshi, which meant tolerant and generous. It was a name that looked towards a future where Japan could learn from its former enemies and become strong in new ways. As Hiroshi grew from baby to toddler to young boy, Yamamoto taught him about numbers and measurements and the importance of testing ideas before believing them. But he also taught him about honor and duty and caring for other people. The goal was not to become American, but to become Japanese people who could succeed in an American kind of world.
By 1950, Japan was changing fast. New factories were being built using American methods but run by Japanese workers. New schools were teaching science and engineering along with traditional subjects like calligraphy and poetry. Young people were learning that asking questions was just as important as respecting answers. Yamamoto found work at a new shipyard that was trying to rebuild Japan's merchant fleet. The ships they built were not warships designed to sink other ships, but cargo ships designed to carry goods around the world. Peace ships instead of warships. Ships that would make Japan rich through trade instead of conquest. The new shipyard used assembly line methods that Yamamoto had first seen in those American books back in the prison camp.
Instead of building each ship from start to finish in one place, they built different parts in different places and then put them together like a giant puzzle. This let them build ships faster and cheaper than the old handcrafted methods ever could. But they did not copy American methods exactly. They improved them. Japanese workers found ways to make the assembly lines more efficient. They developed quality control methods that caught problems before they became expensive mistakes. They created training programs that taught every worker to understand not just their own job, but how their job connected to everyone else's work. Within 5 years, Japanese ships were being sold all over the world. Not because they were the biggest or the most powerful, but because they were reliable and well-made and cost less than ships built in other countries. Japan was learning to compete with brain power instead of gun power. In 1955, 9 years after coming home from the war, Yamamoto was promoted to chief engineer at the shipyard. On his first day in the new job, he stood in his office looking out at workers building 3 cargo ships at the same time. The scene reminded him of those pictures he had seen during the war of American shipyards with their endless rows of ships under construction. But there was a difference. The American shipyards had been built to win a war. This Japanese shipyard was built to win a peace. Instead of building weapons to destroy things, they were building tools to create things. Instead of competing to see who could kill more enemies, they were competing to see who could serve more customers. That evening, Yamamoto sat down at his kitchen table and wrote a letter to his son Hiroshi, who was now 8 years old and could read simple sentences. The letter was meant to be opened when Hiroshi turned 18 and was ready to choose his own path in life. "My dear son," the letter began, "I am writing this to tell you about the most important lesson I learned during the war. It was not a lesson about fighting or dying or being brave. It was a lesson about learning and growing and admitting when you were wrong." He wrote about the day he first saw the USS Iowa's shells falling from beyond the horizon. He wrote about realizing that everything he had believed about Japanese superiority was false. He wrote about the prison camp and the books and the American methods that had seemed like magic until he understood they were just good thinking applied to practical problems. The Iowa's 16-inch guns were not just weapons, he wrote. They were symbols of a country that measured success in tons of steel produced, not just courage displayed. They represented people who believed that the best way to honor your ancestors was to build a better future for your descendants. He sealed the letter and put it in a box with other important family documents. Someday, when Hiroshi was old enough to understand, he would read these words and know that his father had learned the difference between losing a war and losing hope. By 1960, Japan had become one of the world's leading shipbuilding nations. The same country that had lost the war was now winning the peace through exactly the methods Yamamoto had first learned about in an American prison camp. Japanese cars, televisions, and electronics were starting to appear in American stores. The student was becoming the teacher's competitor. On December 7, 1964, exactly 20 years after the battle that had changed his life, Yamamoto stood on the deck of a new Japanese cargo ship preparing for its maiden voyage to California. The ship was longer than the old Yamato had been, but it carried rice and electronics instead of guns and ammunition. It was built to feed people instead of fight people. As the ship pulled away from Yokohama Harbor, Yamamoto thought about all the things that had changed since that terrible morning when American shells had first fallen around his fleet. Japan had lost an empire but gained a future. They had given up trying to conquer the world and had started trying to serve the world instead. The most important change was not in the ships or the factories or the methods of production. The most important change was in the way people thought about strength and success. Real power, Yamamoto had learned, did not come from having the biggest guns or the thickest armor. Real power came from having the best ideas and the most efficient ways of turning those ideas into reality. As the Japanese cargo ships sailed towards America, carrying products that would improve American lives, Yamamoto smiled at the perfect irony. The same country that had once tried to destroy America with military force was now helping America prosper through peaceful trade. The same industrial methods that had defeated Japan in war were now making Japan successful in peace. Standing on the deck watching the sunset over the Pacific Ocean, Commander Takeshi Yamamoto finally understood what he had really learned in captivity. It was not just about building better ships or making stronger steel or organizing work more efficiently. It was about the difference between being proud and being wise, about the difference between fighting the future and learning from it, about the difference between trying to prove you are strong and actually becoming strong. The Iowa's 16-inch guns had taught him that true strength was not about how hard you could hit your enemies. True strength was about how well you could learn from them. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.